So in this video, I have a very important update in a major case against a statewide ban on the possession of magazines that hold more than 10 rounds, and then also a mandatory permit that they put in place. This challenge has now been granted review by the state Supreme Court. So let's break down what just happened. Now, before we jump into this video, I want to thank one of the main sponsors and supporters of this channel, which is Attorneys on Retainer. When it comes to self-defense protection, don't settle for just any other company. AOR is a real law firm backed by actual attorneys, and they will help you in situations that maybe other companies won't. And right now, they've actually expanded their coverage to include a lot of things, including civil liability coverage, red flag law coverage, and a lot of other things that you might find valuable if you carry concealed or if you're ever concerned about getting in a self-defense situation and then needing legal protection after. So I highly recommend you check out AOR. You can check them out using my link down below. And if you sign up with AOR using my link and use the promo code ARMEDSCHOLAR, you can get $50 off of your individual sign-up plan or $25 off of a family plan. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be discussing a challenge against a state magazine ban and then also a permit that they put in place so that you could purchase firearms in the state of Oregon. Oregon Measure 114 put in place a statewide permit to purchase and that magazine ban, but that was ruled unconstitutional and struck down in its entirety by a state court judge. The state court judge in the case issued a permanent injunction against Measure 114. However, the state of Oregon, in response, attempted to remove that permanent injunction through the appeals process. Recently, we talked about how the Oregon Court of Appeals issued a unanimous order upholding the magazine ban and also the permit process that was put in place. That decision went against the permanent injunction. However, this is far from over because we just received a notice that the Oregon State Supreme Court has granted review to this case, and they will now determine if Measure 114's magazine ban and their permit issue is in fact unconstitutional under the state of Oregon's constitution. Now, the case we're talking about in this video is called Arnold versus Kotek. This case challenges Oregon Measure 114 as a violation of the Oregon state constitution. Measure 114 first requires that anyone purchasing a firearm must obtain a permit first to purchase that item. The second significant thing that it does is it creates a ban on the sale, purchase, and transfer and potential possession of any magazines that hold more than 10 rounds after the effective date of the measure. In response to Measure 114, this Arnold case was filed in a state of Oregon State Court. Now, on review, Judge Robert Rocchio ruled in this case that Oregon Measure 114 was invalid under the state's constitution and must be struck down in its entirety with a permanent injunction. But of course, the story did not end there. Oregon then appealed that decision up to the Court of Appeals, and then they asked the Oregon Court of Appeals to reverse the permanent injunction issued by Judge Rocchio and find that Measure 114 was in fact constitutional. Now, it's important to note that since this is a state court challenge under the Oregon State Constitution, there is a different standard for state courts to determine the constitutionality of this state law and whether it violates the state's constitution. Now, under this standard, Oregon applies what is known kind of as a two-phase test. Under phase 1, there is a determination of whether Article 1, Section 27 of the state constitution even applies. And under the first phase, Oregon argues that Article 1, Section 27 does not apply since they believe magazines are not arms and they're not protected items. The plaintiffs in this case argue that that position is clearly incorrect. They argue that these items, these magazines that hold more than 10 rounds, and then also the firearms in question where you would have to get a permit, that clearly those are arms and that they are protected. Now, the second phase of the test is almost looking at the public's interest in balancing the claimed purpose with the potential of undue burden or impacts on the constitutional right to purchase and possess those arms. Of course, Oregon in their Measure 114 argues that the measure is in the public's best interest to stop crime. However, the trial court found that, through expert testimony and data, that the public's harms that were alleged, as the basis for Measure 114, that those were kind of overblown and that the measure does nothing to meet those claimed interests. This case eventually made its way to the Court of Appeals, who recently decided to side with the state of Oregon and strike down Judge Rocchio's permanent injunction. They held that all of ballot Measure 114 is facially valid because the law is capable of some constitutional applications, and at least one potential application would mean that the entire measure should be upheld. The Court of Appeals stated that from the foregoing, the question we must address in this case is whether the enacting body here, the people of Oregon, enacted a reasonable regulation governing the possession and use of constitutionally protected arms in order to promote public safety without unduly frustrating the right to armed self-defense. They went on to state that in making that determination, we are addressing legal questions of enacting body's purpose and the reasonableness of the regulation to achieve that purpose, i.e., whether the regulation is directed at and drafted to achieve the public safety purpose. If, as a legal matter, they state the measure is a reasonable regulation to promote public safety, there is one remaining legal question, and that is the right to armed self-defense unduly frustrated? Any constitutional limitation on a reasonable regulation to promote public safety must be found within the language or history of the constitutional right itself. In essence, all the court believed that matters is whether there is a claimed public safety threat and public safety benefit created by the regulation, and could they support it with some sort of historical justification which underlines the Oregon State Constitution. Now, when it came to the permits, they stated that the permit to purchase program and point of transfer background check reflect a contemporary legislative response to identifiable threats to public safety and a legislative determination that the risk of death or serious injury to members of the public is increased by the threat posed by untrained and dangerous persons obtaining firearms. Therefore, they upheld the permit process as constitutional. Now, when they reviewed the magazine restrictions, they stated that we also observe that the magazine restriction ban is a contemporary legislative response to identify public safety concerns stemming from the advancements in technology and the availability of those advancements to the public that have created observable threats to public safety. So because of that, the Oregon Court of Appeals upheld this Measure 114 and overruled what Judge Rashio said. However, that is now up for review in the Oregon State Supreme Court, and the Oregon State Supreme Court has now granted review to this case, and they will hear arguments in this challenge. In the recent notice from the Oregon State Supreme Court, it indicates that upon consideration by the court, it is ordered that the petition for review filed by the plaintiffs is allowed. Petitioners on review shall have 28 days from the date of this order to file a brief on the merits. Respondents, the state of Oregon, on review shall have 28 days thereafter to file a brief on the merits. Upon request by a party with good cause shown, the court will grant requests for a short extension of time, not exceeding 14 days, to file a brief. They then set oral arguments, and oral arguments were set to take place November 6th, 2025 at 9 a.m. at the Supreme Court location there in the state of Oregon. And the case is scheduled to be heard in this second hearing that day on that morning. So the Oregon State Supreme Court has granted review to this case, and they have set oral arguments to take place in this challenge. So this is great news for the state of Oregon. The state Supreme Court has now decided to consider this case. They grant a review to this. They're going to hear oral arguments, and they're going to decide whether or not the state can put in place magazine bans and permit restrictions through Measure 114. Now, the Oregon Supreme Court tends to lean left, of course, but regardless, this kind of cues up a major state magazine ban and permit challenge kind of all wrapped into one. And it's kind of an interesting case that will eventually make its way to the United States Supreme Court. The best case scenario, of course, here would be for the Oregon State Supreme Court to find that Measure 114 is unconstitutional and that Judge Rashio got this correct. And that would essentially force the state of Oregon to then go to the United States Supreme Court and ask for them to reverse what happened down below. However, I will say that that's kind of maybe a long shot because the Oregon State Supreme Court, of course, like I said, leans left. But that would be an interesting situation where it would kind of put a lot of pressure on Oregon itself and the United States Supreme Court to have to take this case and deal finally with magazine bans and permit restrictions kind of all in one case. Regardless, this is good news that the Oregon State Supreme Court has granted review to this, and in general, it's another major magazine and permit challenge that is moving forward and putting a lot of pressure on the Supreme Court to finally have to take action on these issues. So good news out of the state of Oregon. The state of Oregon Supreme Court is going to review this, and it's moving along. And this is big for a lot of people in those states that live with these types of restrictions. So that's what's going on with the Oregon magazine ban and the permit restriction that they put in place with Measure 114. As we get more information, as it develops, I will let you guys know. But as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And never forget, this nation was built by ARMED scholars, and this nation will be maintained by ARMED scholars.